Hello everybody. Welcome to our first lecturette. This one might call a lecture rather than a lecturette. This one's a little longer than the most that we're going to come to see. We're going to talk about a huge number of topics in this course, but I want to start with an introduction to social psychology. Believe it or not, since I was age 15 or so, I had wanted to become a social psychologist. Now, I took a kind of deviation there. I didn't really get to college seriously until my late 30s, but eventually I made it. I ended up at Ohio State. What do you think? What would happen right now? You by yourself. This is Annika, by the way, so she's coming to hang out with us for a little bit. What if I was to go OH? Yeah. Even if you're alone at home, you can do the rest of that, right? And there's like, if you Google OHIO images, you can get about 65,000 of these pictures. I don't know what it is about Ohio State and people traveling the world. They want to do this pose, and they want to be they want the picture there. And if you want to see a lecture that opens up with a different image like this every time, then you're going to have to take Psych of Emotion with me. I'm only going to do it this once here in social psych. So let's play social psychology. What's the social psychology defined? It's a scientific study of, and get this, how we feel, how we think, how we behave in regard to people and situations, and how our feelings, thoughts, perceptions are affected by other people and situations. Reality versus perception becomes an important aspect here because, you know, our perceptions are just that. It's what we perceive, and it comprises our reality, but notice it's not necessarily a shared reality. Our perceptions might differ from somebody else's perceptions, so that becomes an important point. So is it a perceived reality? I think that's probably a safe way to put it, right? Now, social psychology relative to other areas of study, what do we know? Well, sociology studies trends across times, groups, kind of societal level influences, so it usually takes a bigger picture than social psychology. It looks at situational forces, no two ways about it, culture, political forces, right? But it looks at the outcome of those forces to a greater extent. Social psychology probably a bit more in the head and begins to look at the processes that how those forces on us actually operate. But there's a lot of overlap, so it'd be nitpicking to try and draw this solid boundary between sociology and social psychology. But sociology, you know, for example, might ask a question: does the presence of broken windows in a neighborhood increase the amount of vandalism or other types of crime? And sociological studies, which are often largely correlational, say yes, this does appear to be the case. And when we learn about this, then, for example, when the housing market tanked, let's go up to Cleveland, where it was especially horrible. Housing values plummeted, a lot of houses went vacant. Rather than make them targets for vandalism, one of the things that the city of the city of Cleveland did, and other cities have done this as well, is to require, if you board up the windows with plywood, then you had to paint something that looked like a window on the plywood, so that the appearance of the neighborhood didn't look as bad. And of course, you board up the windows so that you avoid the broken glass. Right? So, how do immigrants that assimilate compare economically to immigrants that remain in, let's say, isolated ethnic neighborhoods? And this is a great question for sociology, but it's a little too broad for social psychology. Social psychology is still relative to other studies. Well, cognitive psychology studies mental processes, right? And it could be perception, it could be memory, it can be cognition itself. These are all parts of cognitive psychology. But again, where is the boundary between cognitive psychology and social psychology? Well, there's a whole area, and in fact, I had a course when I was at University of California, Irvine as an undergraduate. I took a class in social cognition with Dr. Pete Ditto. So there's overlap again. I think one thing you'll find about social psychology, it tends to be really frickin' greedy. Social psychology thinks that it kind of owns almost all psychological phenomenon. So, cognitive psychology will study thinking, memory, learning, perception, and here you can see here's a perception lab where you have a young child being exposed to a stimulus, and then they're going to measure the results of that. Now, one thing that I learned very early on when I was in a graduate school here at Ohio State, right? I started, in 1999, fall of 1999, and you get kind of pumped up. I'm in graduate school, man. I'm going to get my master's. I'm going to get my PhD. Shit, people are going to call me doctor, all this good stuff. And I did the typical newbie thing. People would ask, well, what do you do? And I would say, well, I'm training to be a psychologist. Wrong answer, because then people say, you know, I know someone who would make an excellent case study. Or, you know, I've got this problem. I remember one time someone said, I've been having these dreams. And I'm like, oh, do tell. And it was a pretty bad one because I'm at a resort at dinner, and I just met this guy, and he's telling me about these bad dreams he has. So I'm just listening because I opened my stupid mouth. I'm a psychologist, and he says, yeah, I have these dreams that I'm flying a plane and I crash, and the dream just recurs again day after day, and multiple dreams every night. And I'm like, man, that must be frightening. And he says, yeah, no shit, I'm a pilot. And I'm going, oh my God, yeah, he was a commercial pilot. First thing I did was ask him, what airline do you fly for? Because I don't want to be going home from the resort on your plane. I didn't say that. So, no, I'm not analyzing you, but that's natural, because most people, when you say psychology, they think therapist, they think clinical psychology. And this is the study of difficulty and disorders. This is, you know, a godsend to people who need psychological help. You know, bless the clinical psychologist. A lot of social, hi Sochi, a lot of social psychologists probably are not that interested, right? The clinical psychologists can develop development of treatment and programs, right? Anyone know this cartoon? Trivia question, what is the name of this cartoon? I think it went one season, so I'll leave that to you. Personality psychology. Now, personality psychology and social psychology have a unique relationship and an amazing relationship, and most social psychologists have to acknowledge a certain level of personality in terms of traits, because it becomes part of our research. More on that later. Personality psychology is more interested in stable characteristics of a person, so that's kind of like their core aspect. What does it mean to be a narcissist? How does extroversion affect the way that you view your world, right? They're less interested in situational influences. That's not to say they aren't interested in but they're less interested than a social psychologist would be, right? And they develop models of personality, like so unstable versus stable, and we can array people, we can measure where they position themselves on that dimension, versus introverted and extroverted, and any number of personality dimensions. There's really limitless, countless. So, social psychology relative to other areas of study then. Social psychology studies the impact of social phenomenon, that is, internal states and situations on individuals and groups. But the thing is, we do it in terms of averages and probabilities. So when I went to graduate school at Ohio State, right, we operate an experimental lab. I was in the Tetlock lab for 3 years, and then Tetlock left to go to Berkeley. And then I ended up at Marilyn Brewer's lab for my next 3 2/3 years. Yeah, it took me 6 2/3 years to earn my PhD. It was a long haul, hardest work I've ever done in my life. But notice, in the 8,000 participants that I ran, because we ran some massive studies over those 6.5 years, right? 7,000 or 8,000 participants, never once did I look at an individual response, really, to any of the things we did in the laboratory. What I do is randomly assign 20 people to this condition, and then I look at the average response of those 20 people. So social psychologists are kind of whack in that respect, is don't tend to look at individual responses. Right? So we think in terms of probability of behavior. Given the situation, what is the probability that someone will respond in this manner? Notice, I'm not telling you this individual will respond in this way. What I'm saying is people on average will respond this way in a given situation, which also means there's people who don't respond that way. Right? So it's a proportionate thing. Social psychologists can be really highly interactionist. That is, studying the interaction of personality, group membership, emotion, and most importantly, the effects of the situation. And when we go social cog, then we start going more and more in the head. We say, how does the situation affect people's memory, their perception, right? And then how does it affect their behaviors? All right, I got a little quiz for you already, I know. First lecture, already tossing a quiz at you. It's all right. It's worth as many points as you want, but the points don't count towards your grade. So have a ball with this. True or false? Look at this image. Both center patches are the same shade of gray. True or false? Well, if we strip it away, it's true. The patch on the right appeared darker due to the perceptual contrast with his background. Now, this is a straight-up kind of cognitive psychology illusion, right? But I'm borrowing it as a social psychologist because I got a point to make here. That is, the situation, the context, shapes perception. So that's red meat to a social psychologist. That's what we're all about. Does a person look or behave the same when they're with their family as when they're with a group of friends? Notice the context changes, so the person's appearance might change as well. So this is really about the complexity of behavior. And one thing you'll find with most social psychologists is they finally kind of ended up in social psychology, or social psychology resonated with them because they have a preference for complexity. For most social psychologists, there ain't an easy answer. They like the complexity. They like to say, well, under this situation, this is likely to happen. But under a different situation, then maybe the reverse is likely to happen. That's the kind of stuff we love, right? And Kurt Lewin, let's go back to the 1920s, 1930s, is one of the primary interactionists in social psychology history. And we don't talk enough about Lewin. It's sad. I'm working hard to bring more and more Lewin into my courses where it's appropriate, right? And Kurt Lewin emphasized the person-situation interaction, and he had an interesting career. Like many psychologists, German psychologists or German Jew psychologists in the 1930s, they had to leave Germany because they saw what was coming under the Nazi regime. And they understood and they left. So many of them had to kind of uproot their careers and go to Great Britain, go to the United States, go to Switzerland, go somewhere, because they saw the writing on the wall that had they not, the consequences might be devastating. And if you want to know more about that, you could take Psych of Adjustment with me. We'll talk a good deal about Viktor Frankl and the existential movement that grew out of that situation. Viktor Frankl had been swept up and taken to Auschwitz. He survived to write about his experiences. Regardless, when we talk about Kurt Lewin, then, he emphasizes the person-situation interaction, and thus behavior is summarized in this equation. And for Lewin, he's a breath of fresh air kind of in social psychology at this point in time. He's coming from a point of physics rather than a point of biology. And this is a much different approach, right? So what he's saying is behavior then is a function of a person in their environment. So if we want to understand, and one of the reasons we typically want to understand is because we want to be able to make relatively accurate future predictions. What we're talking about here then is who's the person and what do we know about them, and that's the personality psychology part of it, right? But then here's the environment, how is it going to impact them? So when we're trying to predict or explain behavior, it's best, according to Lewin and many of us, that behavior is a function of the person in the environment. So one postulate of this theory is you can't change people, and Lewin was big on this. You can't change people. And I have two rules in psychology, right? One of them I borrowed from Lewin. You can't change people, right? And the second rule is the best predictor of future behavior from a person is their past behavior. Now there's a myriad of exceptions, but the single best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and realize that you can't change people. And if you take those two rules from me, I think it'll make your life a lot easier. So one thing you can do though, and this is straight up social psychology, is you can change the environment and that will affect the observed behavior in many cases. And that's what Lewin was about, change the behavior. Now I want to talk about another social psychologist. These two huge people in social psychology, and this is Leon Festinger. Festinger studied with Lewin, and this has become very, very important in psychology. If I go to a conference, within 5 minutes of conversing with someone new, they'll say, where did you go to school? That is, what program you were in, and who was your advisor, right? So when I say I was a Brewer student, or when I say I was a Tetlock student, people in the social psych game know what that means, and that's kind of my pedigree or my lineage, right? And going to Ohio State social psychology was a blessing, because let's face it, Ohio State social psychology is ranked #1 in the country, at least #1 to #5, consistently through its history. So let's talk about Festinger, and we trace his roots. So where did Festinger study? Well, he was a Lewin student. Oh my God, right? So Festinger studied with Kurt Lewin. He embraced the scientific method, and that's what he's really contributing. That's what he's pulling in. He originally had no interest in social psychology. He was studying cognitive psychology and kind of with a developmental bent, but really applying the scientific method to this. And he became one of the eminent, maybe top 10 social psychologists when we look at that. But let's see what he said here. The looser methodology of the social psychological studies, the vagueness of the relation of the data to Lewinian concepts and theories, right, seemed unappealing to me for my youthful penchant for rigor. So he wanted numbers, he wanted data, and over time he softened and he embraced kind of the Lewinian philosophy and brought in his methodological rigor in combination with the two. A huge contributor. When we talk about cognitive dissonance, we're going to be talking Festinger. When we talk about downward social comparisons, we're going to be talking about Festinger. So we can rattle off several huge theories in social psychology that came to us from Leon Festinger. Now, how does social psychology line up with what we know intuitively about our world? And I like to talk about common sense psychology, or grandma psychology, if you will. This is stuff we all know to be true through our experience. Problem is, sometimes social psychology empirically generated research findings demonstrate that grandma was right. Other times it demonstrates that grandma was a bit off the mark. No offense to grandma, right? So let's get a grandma here. Looks an awful lot like my Nonna on my Italian side of the family. Let me ask you this. Don't have sex on the first date if you want a boy to respect you. I bet more than one young woman has heard that, and is it sound advice? Well, empirically, what I found, I had some students, they did a brief study on this. It wasn't their whole study, but just a little piece of their study, and they kind of looked at other Ohio State students, developed a questionnaire, and what do you think? What date is the green light for sex according to many the average Ohio State student? And that was date number 3, right? Not date number 1. So it was borne out. Grandma was supported for the most part. Okay, it's a good thing she's pretty because she's probably dumb. And there's a stereotype that attractive people are less intelligent. Is that the case? Is it not? Notice that this can be put to an empirical test. People can be rated on their attractiveness. They can be given a measure of intelligence, and we can see if there's a correlation between the two. That would be the objective view of this, but the stereotype does exist, right? And we heard this long rash that they've gone away now. It's probably, what, 7, 8 years ago, of dumb blonde jokes, right? Which is based on that stereotype that intelligence and attractiveness usually don't coincide. Again, a stereotype. Here, grandma probably not doing too well on the ledger. Okay? Now, if you want him to do something, reward him for it. And parents know this. Grandma's told us. What does this mean? Hi, Annika. Well, this is soundly supported, and it comes to us from behaviorists, right? Like, anyone want to take a guess on this? B.F. Skinner is a good one to look at here, who developed the Skinner box and really methodically, empirically tested the effect of rewards and punishments on behavior. And notice, those are situational manipulations. I've done some original reading of Skinner, and it really changed my perception of behaviorism. Kissing cousin to social psychology, if you will. Fascinating work. Action speaks louder than words. Well, what we see, I'm sure many of you have heard this, or maybe you've had it told to you. I know when I was in high school, I heard it more than once, especially from my headmaster, Roy Burgesson. Yeah, Mark, action speaks louder than words. It wasn't always what I wanted to hear, but the older I get, the more right I realize he was. And what we find is that the behavior is usually a better determiner, a better explanation than what people are saying. And if you have a choice between verbal and nonverbal, believing one or the other, if they don't coincide, go with the nonverbal behavior rather than the verbal message. It'll be more representative of what's actually going on. Let's try this out. Do you know who this guy is? Pretty famous social psychologist. He did the Stanford prison experiment. Not experiment, Stanford prison demonstration, if you will. Yes, this is Phil Zimbardo. But that's not the issue. The question is here, what do you think? True or false? Repeated exposure to the same face leads us to like it less. Remember what Grandma said, don't spend too much time with that boy, don't spend too much time with that girl, because you guys will get sick of each other. Right? Remember when we first started pairing up, kind of dating, and we would spend hours with the object of our affection, and then we would get home because we had to go home, and then we'd probably pick up the phone and spend 4 or 5 more hours talking to him on the phone like we couldn't get enough of him. And Grandma's worried. She said, "Ow, back off a little bit. You'll ruin him." Actually, what we find is that familiar people in their faces are generally liked more than less familiar people. And when we talk about loving and liking later on in the course, we'll see where this came from and how it was supported. An amazing piece of science by Dr. Science, Dr. Robert Science. So, experimental social psychology, common and not so common sense. Social psychology studies sometimes come in and just verify what we already knew from Grandma or culturally, and that's okay if you get to do that once. You get to empirically demonstrate these old ideas that are obvious, but they're only going to publish once, and then people are going to say, yeah, fine, we already knew that. So, for example, the more people are angered by a crime, the more they want to punish the person that committed that crime. Well, duh, right? But if you look at Rucker